Good morning. Good morning. It's really nice to be back here. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Brooke Ray Rivera. It used to be Brooke Ray Smith, and I grew up in Los Altos. I grew up in Mountain View, right on the border of Los Altos, and my mom worked at the Linden Tree Bookstore for my entire life until she passed away in 2011. My dad lives nearby, so I was staying with him last night. It's really nice to be back in this town and seeing everything that's been happening. We're close to happening. It sounds like there's some good things afoot. Yeah, as David says, I spent 6 years at Passerelle. No, a little bit more in the light, a little bit. 6 years at Passerelle Investments when it was Passerelle. I started in 2009, and it was really when we started buying buildings kind of quietly in the downtown. My background in urban planning has always been the main focus of my work at Passerelle, so I was much more the outward-facing community development side of the team, and there were 3 of us at the time. So the experience that I got through Passerelle has led me directly to what I'm doing now, which is what I'm going to spend the bulk of the time talking about. I now run a small nonprofit up in San Francisco. It's called Build Public. I think there's some interesting lessons learned that I can share with you guys today that may help inform some of the stuff you're doing. Build Public is a small San Francisco specific nonprofit. Should I just, yeah, I'll just okay, sure. Okay, how am I going to start this? My nonprofit in San Francisco is actually quite similar to the work that I was doing in Passerelle. However, now I'm doing it from a very small nonprofit standpoint, so I do not have the funding base that I used to. However, we're doing some creative solutions for bridging private investment and public benefit. All right. So you guys know all this, but this is sort of my standard slide deck. Some of my very proud moments at Passerelle were initiating the 3rd Street Green in 2014. And some of the, activation of public space that we were able to do has been quite informative in the work I'm doing up in San Francisco. Can you see if that's
Yeah, no, I'm fine.
Okay. Yeah.
You want to stand under the light.
Okay, and so we had live music next. There were some passive uses as well. This was the ballet class from 3rd between Main and State, and they came out and would have their lunches on the green in 2014. We also had done the State Street Green the year before, as you're well aware. I think the bike racks are probably still out there somewhere.
I was just trying to find my picture up there. I was standing on the green.
Yeah. This needs no explanation. You've already been here. Was everyone here around for the Los Altos SF MoMA Project Los Altos? This one's actually quite interesting in that I have been fighting tooth and nail with the city of San Francisco to get them to paint something like a mural on a street, and they have refused. And I've said, you guys, Los Altos did it. Little Los Altos, and you're big San Francisco, and you can't do it. And they were like, no. So anyway, you guys are ahead of the big city in many respects. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about Build Public. What is it? I usually start with the why of what we do, and then we move into the how and the what. But the premise upon which Build Public was founded is that cities and neighborhoods deserve great public space. Really, public space is what informs your sense of the character of the city, and it directly contributes to quality of life. So, when properly cared for, public spaces can be amazing amenities to unite communities, providing safe spaces to relax and play and connect and celebrate. All these things, I think, down here we realize much more because the public realm is sort of more pleasant. And I will say we also have backyards down here. In San Francisco, the public realm is the city's backyard, and so it's even more important for it to be well maintained. And sometimes it's not. So when public spaces are neglected, as we may see in San Francisco, who's been to San Francisco in the last month or so? People, and did you have, what was your sense of the public realm? Sidewalks, cleanliness? Did anybody walk down Market Street?
It's dirty and there's a lot of homeless people.
Yes. I think that's sort of sums it up. That's a lot of what we're trying to work on too. So our mission is we keep this, apply the spirit of innovation in here because we're really trying to bring a tech startup approach to nonprofit public placemaking. But we empower neighborhoods to create and sustain great public spaces. And that involves finding funding, figuring out governance structures for both construction and maintenance, and then building new public spaces as well. So, okay, so what? There are a lot of people who have a lot of ideas about public space, and you all know this too. We've all had these wonderful ideas about how to improve Los Altos, how to improve San Francisco. Okay, so we say, yeah, you're right, there are a lot of people who do that. But what there is a shortage of is implementation tools, and that's really what our nonprofit focuses on. So, how do we get these ideas from the cloud back down onto reality and make them happen? So we also sort of use this as a tongue-in-cheek dig on classic city processes versus what we could have. And wouldn't it be great if, I think this applies to Los Altos as well in my experience, but not just Los Altos, I think any city in the US particularly has processes and systems and bureaucracy and things that are not particularly fun to engage with. I think that this group and myself and the people that I hang out with, we engage in these processes. But a lot of people don't like to pick up the rotary phone and, go through the conventional city processes. So how do we come up with some new ways of engaging people that are fun and perhaps even sexy and interesting? The way that we firmly believe is important to do this is through public-private partnerships. I think this is the way that cities are going to be improving these days. We need to leverage private resources to bring in and supplement where cities cannot go. Because everyone, city public sector is cash strapped, they're bound by politics, they're bound by resources, and private sector can be more nimble sometimes. So that's where we sit in that space, and I call ourselves a public space innovation toolbox. So we have three main program areas. One, our place program is where we're actually building new public spaces, and I'll talk about the 6 new public space projects that we have currently ongoing. We also set up really innovative stewardship structures. So this middle program is probably one of our most innovative and celebrated components of the work that we do. And I'll talk about what that means. But really, once spaces are built, if you don't maintain them over time, you may as well not build them at all. And then our policy work, we've done some work with other cities and with San Francisco. Most notably, we worked with the city of Menlo Park in 2015 to work their economic development plan. And I wrote most of that. And while I'm not an economic development consultant, we had a very interesting angle on creative ways to channel private resources into public infrastructure. So how do you leverage upzoning and city tools to actually create pots of money that can be used for funding new bike lanes and parks and public amenities. So another way I sort of frame the public space toolbox, this is kind of the soup to nuts of how do you make public space. And the 3rd Street Green, State Street Green, those all fall into tactical pop-ups. So, and like parking day and the parklets and all that stuff are fantastic and important ways to trigger people's imagination, get them excited about what's possible. But then, let's see, so you can go one more slide. So we do all of these things, but I think these 2 things are the stuff that not very many people do, and this is what we focus on the most. Once we build a space, we also work on activation and programming, but again, a lot of different groups do this kind of thing already. So we do these 2 things, but this is really the nuts and the bolts that we found very few other groups are actually tackling because it is very unfun and unsexy sometimes to do the long slog of designing and building and funding and maintaining permanent new spaces that are going to last 50 to 100 years. It's not just the one-day parking day. So again, there's all these components of powerful placemaking, public-private partnerships are the key. Another thing we like to say is transparency is the new green. It's a little, again, a little bit cheeky, but I think we firmly believe in these public-private partnerships. The only way that they work is if you have over-communication between every single party. And so I find that is the bulk of the work that we do on all of our public space projects is over-communicating and sharing with everybody. The city needs to be in the loop, the community needs to be in the loop. You have to translate all those messages to the designers, getting all the approvals, and then you have to talk to whoever's going to be funding this thing and make sure that they're excited. So it's constant rotation of transparency and communication. So I'll talk about some of our projects. I'll try to be, how much time should I take on this? Because I can scale this up or down.
9:30 is when we go there.
9:30? Okay, it's 8:45. Good. All right, well, so we have projects all over San Francisco. They fall into a couple of different categories. These 3 projects on the right, it's very hard to see this map, but these are new public plazas that are converting old streets into permanent public spaces. These all rely on the same funding mechanism and sort of approval process, so I'm going to talk about them in a bulk. We have 2 projects called green benefit districts, which are the innovative stewardship component of the work that we do, and I'll talk about those next after that. And then our alleys projects, these are a little bit more tactical, but does anyone, I know the McBurneys have, but have you guys been to San Francisco in Hayes Valley? There's a very celebrated, the first ever Blue Bottle Coffee is located on an alleyway. Who's been there? Okay, a fair number of you. So it's an interesting example of, again, an underutilized street that has been added to make it feel much more pedestrian. And people end up sitting in the street, walking around and sort of mingling and lingering in the street. And it feels much more like a pedestrian dominated space, even though cars can still move through it. So we have 2 projects like that in the works. We actually also have 1 new project in Central Soma that I can talk about as well. So first, here's one of the creative tools that we've figured out how to use in San Francisco. This is something that is San Francisco specific at the moment, but I think it applies to Los Altos, and so that's why I'm going to talk about it today. It leverages impact fees. So almost every city in the country exacts some sort of impact fee on development projects that are going to be happening in their city. And those impact fees go ostensibly to cover the added impact that those projects are having on the neighborhood. So most cities have them in different buckets. I remember Los Altos has a parks impact fee and a fee of schools and a transportation. There's a bunch of different types of impact fees. San Francisco also has this, and they uniquely have this tool called an in-kind agreement where they allow some of the infrastructure impact fees, which is the bucket that would go towards new public parks, to be kept by the developer to actually build a public park. So new development, they have to pay the impact fees. There's a set dollar amount that's just based on their project. That typically would go in a lump sum check to the city, and the city would then, at some time in the future, in some location, build a new park or improvement. This allows the developer the city has to authorize this, but then the developer keeps those dollars and instead uses them to build a park. Thereby, you get private delivery of a public amenity, so it happens faster, it happens more cost effectively. The developer is very motivated to get this done and get it done well, because part of the agreement is that this development cannot open its doors. It doesn't get certificate of occupancy until the park is done. And not just done, but it has to meet all of the standards that the city requires. It has to meet community, it has to get a threshold of community support. So it really has to be a legitimate public project. This isn't sort of a box check, let's put some concrete over there and, the skyscraper here, and it's like a financial district, vacuous, windy plaza. These things have to be good. So we've been leveraging this tool on 3 projects. The first of which, so then we don't stop there. This is our build public process. So we figure out the funding. This ends up giving a bulk of the funding to these new plazas. We then do the whole collaborative design process that I was talking about with city, community, and funder, iteratively all around the table. And then we also set up a long-term stewardship entity to make sure that this public space is well taken care of over time. And usually that means that it's something supplementing what the city will already be doing. So the city can provide some services, but they can't always provide all of the services that are needed on, a high-end plaza. For example, if there's, non-standard pavers or design features that the city's public works department kind of doesn't know how to clean or doesn't know what to do with. We run into this in San Francisco. They say, look, you have to do this. You have to take care of this because these are exotic plants. Like these are not our standard shrubs that we usually use. So we help set up that as well. Okay, next slide. So here's our first major win. John and Maddie have been there. They came to our grand opening party, which was just 2 weeks ago on October 5th. Dogpatch Arts Plaza is located in the Dogpatch neighborhood, which is sort of southeast of San Francisco. This is a dead-end street that butts up against the 280 freeway embankment. For reference, if you are familiar with the Dogpatch neighborhood, it's right kitty corner to Esprit Park. It's kind of a big green park. Right behind the camera here. And then this has just been a dumpster-filled alley for many, many years. We have now converted it into a pedestrian-only public plaza. It took 5 years. We started in 2013 and finally got it open. It has a major mural on one side. We got this guy he owns a lift warehouse, so they rent cranes and things. It was just a warehouse wall, so he agreed to let us hire an artist to paint a giant mural on the side. There's now also a beautiful major sculpture in the middle. This is the reason why it's called Dogpatch Arts Plaza. It's kind of nodding to the industrial artistic character of the Dogpatch neighborhood. It's part of the theme of the space. But the goal is that right now there's a 7-foot tall sort of rearing centaur sculpture in the middle that we found a beautiful local artist who does work at Burning Man, and the goal is that it would be a rotating annual sculpture. So, every year there's something a little bit different and exciting that makes you want to go back here. Some other physical features, we have built-in riser bleacher seating so we can hold really interesting events in the plaza. These benches all move, so we can move them around in different configurations to either make a single large space or several small kind of rooms or clusters. And on the other side, this is a new building. This is the development project that we leverage the impact fees to help fund the plaza. But there's a ground floor cafe on this side. And that's very important because every project that we do, we are adamant that there has to be some people who have skin in the game, eyes on the street, and stewards who are going to be watching this space. So the public spaces that we've seen in San Francisco that are failures are often failures because there are no invested private interests who care about the space. And I think I'd be willing to entertain, ideas from anybody of like, oh, well, here's a space, why does this not work? And most often it's because there isn't anyone who really cares about it. So to have a ground floor cafe is really important. The funding model for this, again, so this cost a little bit, about $1.5 million to produce in its entirety. We got $850,000 from this in-kind agreement through the developer. And then our nonprofit was able to secure 2 major grants, one for $200,000 and one for about $50,000 from different agencies in the city of San Francisco. So we kind of patch it together. I think that's like the interesting bridging private interest and public benefit. What we do now is I just have to spend more time than I did at Passerelle patching together the funding, the funding portfolio. But it still works, and it's open, and you can see it. It's at 19th and Indiana, and it's open public 24/7. There are no gates. Anyone can go there at any time. Now, our nonprofit is working with a neighborhood group, Friends of Dogpatch Arts Plaza, to program it, so have regular arts programming and cultural programming and block parties and things like that. So this is now the fun part of sort of like the 3rd Street Green activities that I used to do.
I just, since I'm on the Arts Commission, I'm going to ask you an Arts Commission question about the mural funding, and did they help decide, or were you guys able to just do all of that on your own since it's public-private?
Yep, great question. For the sculpture, because so this is all still a publicly owned street. This is owned by Public Works Department and always will be. The sculpture had to go through the San Francisco Arts Commission's Visual Arts Committee, which weighs in on all the sculptures, same as the commission here. The mural, because it's on private property, I believe we didn't have to. But the Visual Arts Committee weighs in on all that stuff. The funding for the art actually came from an art endowment. It was a donation from these guys because they were interested in having something interesting for their residents to look at. So what we do need to raise though is an endowment for future art. So we do have a campaign going on if anybody's interested in donating to fund some art. I mean, this is how it happens, and yeah.
Is there an ongoing maintenance fund, and if so, how much is that?
Great question. Yes, that is what I'm spending a lot of my time setting up right now. We're setting up. So Friends of Dogpatch Plaza it's a neighborhood association. Technically, it's an unincorporated association, fiscally sponsored by our nonprofit. We're getting some funds from several different sources on a regular basis to fund the ongoing maintenance and operations and programming. So, where to start? So, we're actually getting in-kind funds from the developer because they have a property management service that's doing maintenance on their building anyway. And so we've quantified what that would be if they added service to bring it out to the plaza. They've agreed to just cover that rather than pay us to hire a new maintenance company to do that. So they have an in-kind contribution of, someone who's coming out and they're trimming those trees, they're trimming these trees too. We have about $12,000 a year coming in from the Green Benefit District that I'm about to talk about. It's in this area. So that's basically, it's a neighborhood scale assessment district. And the funds are to go for public realm greening and improvements. The cafe is also contributing some money because they have tables and chairs outside in the plaza. And usually those funds would have to go for a tables and chairs permit with the Public Works Department, but because the plaza already went through this whole major encroachment permit, there's some legalese behind the permitting that happened here, but they can transfer that money directly into the plaza. So what we're looking at right now is about $18,000 a year for, in addition to the in-kind actual maintenance, to work on programming, developing a capital reserve for repairs and things like that. General, it's going to be for our time unless we can find someone else to hire to do it. Work with the city and make sure that everything's compliant over time.
But the day-to-day tracking and programming and people there is from Friends of Dogpatch?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I was going to say, because the ongoing maintenance is key and costs are only going to escalate, have you looked at programming events where you can make money to help sustain the park and the plaza?
Yes, great question. It can be a political third rail to talk about, sort of the commodification of public space or the privatization of public space to hold events, but we firmly believe that that's a great and important tool. I think people look at spaces like Bryant Park in New York as either a shining success or, a sellout, sort of a failure. It's where they have a lot of sponsorships and a lot of, kiosks and things that make money. So we're hoping, we actually started working with, there's an event, an event space provider a few blocks away, the Pearl, that rents out this beautiful warehouse for weddings and corporate events and all these things. And so we're working with them to add this as another space that they could rent out. We have some limitations from the city on how many private events you can hold per year because it is a public space. But there are private events that are publicly accessible, and then there are private events that are limited access. And so there's a maximum number of limited access private events you can do. But you can have more privately funded and privately organized events that still have public access. Anyway, there's a lot of nuances, but yes, that would be another funding tool that brings in more revenue for the annual maintenance and more programming. And we can restrict it so that any funds that come in that are additional revenue beyond cost covering specifically go towards Dogpatch Arts Plaza programming and arts. You know.
I'm not a lawyer, but I'm just curious about, are there any sort of in perpetuity agreements with that project developer? Who knows if they sell it to someone else and they're like, I don't want to deal with this whole thing, because they just shut their doors and, you know, look the other way.
Yes, great. These are such great questions. Yeah, we're working on that one too. So there's an agreement between the property owner and the city to be kind of the guardians of this public space, because as I was saying earlier, you know, these are above and beyond materials and quality of pavers and the art. So there's like extra insurance that's required. They looked at us as you know, our annual budget is about $350,000 a year. And they said, well, you guys can't hold any, I mean, there's no weight if we had signed an agreement with you, little nonprofit. We need someone who would go after if something went wrong, or, you know, they actually have this clause that we're sort of trying to negotiate with them right now, that, you know, if in the event that the city of San Francisco decides they want this to be a street again, the developer, this property owner would have to pay to remove all of the improvements. Which, you know, everyone's sort of head scratching. It's like, well, why would you ever want this back as a dead-end street, first of all? And second of all, if you did, anyway, should it be the private entity that takes out all the good stuff they put in? So yes, there's an agreement between the property owner and the city to oversee the maintenance of this space. And so then we're part of that maintenance kit and caboodle. The property is providing the insurance for the plaza too. And then what we're finishing right now, this is all because this plaza just opened like 2 weeks ago, literally. We're working on the agreement that spells out the maintenance, we call it the management agreement, and that basically ties this property owner to contributing something to the public plaza. That they're signing an agreement that also the benefit district is signing, and the retail cafe is signing, and our friends at Dogpatch Arts Plaza.
And it would go to the next owner.
Yeah, we run with the deed.
We have people who would want to tear that thing out and put back the concrete, so.
Okay, we were looking all over the city for your first couple of plazas. For this property, can you prioritize the attributes that attracted you to this property?
Yes, great. Well, yes and no. Great question. I think my goal as the first full-time executive director of this little nonprofit that's getting itself up and running is that we have the financial wherewithal to go anywhere in the city and find the biggest needs and then seek out a developer or some funding to do what we want to do. Right now, as a startup, we were founded in 2012, got our nonprofit status in 2014, and then they hired me in 2015. We have to go where the funding is. So we're right now still the tail at the end of the dog of the funding. So this was a development project with an enlightened developer who we came to and said, hey, are you willing to try this? And they said, yeah, this is a cool space. It would be, it's a win-win. And this is an interesting part of our nonprofit too, is that we do operate in a space where the developer and the property owner is getting benefit from this public space, but so is the public. So, I think folks who feel like it has to be an either or and only one party can win, don't often understand the work that we do, because it is a win-win. There are benefits that this is accruing to the property value, although one of my other tasks and interests is to try to get developers to put these kinds of things in their pro formas, because proximity to public space has been shown to increase property values, and we all intuitively know that, but none of them ever put it into their pro formas when they're evaluating. I mean, Joanna, correct me if I'm wrong, maybe you guys did.
Yeah, all the developments I've worked on, have been enlightened and developed.
Yeah.
So we've always had parks of some description, and I've been very fortunate there.
But do you actually build that into your pro forma and think about the increased rents you can get from having the park versus not having the park? That's what I think isn't happening yet.
Like when we were at Toll Brothers, we went into minutia, to the top floor units facing to the park, the top floor units facing the mountains, facing the bay, down to the ground floor level. It was so detailed, it was like blew your mind.
Nice.
Yeah.
Nice.
But
Yeah, maybe that's happening now, which is great.
for many, you are absolutely correct. They don't build that into their pro forma.
Because
And
it's
they
a little
don't see
risky.
the
It's a
benefit.
little-
It's like, let's just do like the bare minimum, let's maximize to the size of the lot and just build. And they don't realize the intrinsic value of what a park or a small open space could bring. And it's worth considering.
The sort of the underneath question with everything that's new and exciting and different is, how did you build community support to resist, which I'm sure there were reactionary forces who wanted no change, no matter what it was. They wanted things to be bucolically 1957, which is the issue we have in Altos. So how did you deal with that?
Interestingly, yeah, this is really interesting. This neighborhood is ready. I mean, there is
Well, there's so many young
onslaught.
families there too.
There are growing numbers of families. There's sort of the old, the Victorian and worker housing that now has become really popular, right? It's a very high-end community. There has been, by the time we got there was already such an onslaught of major development. Like, they're getting a ton of density in this neighborhood that people opposed this project, but they didn't oppose the park. And we are only focused over
That sounds familiar.
We just want the good bits.
Yeah. So, we have strength on
We just want that.
we get to, and I relish being in that space and not being in the development, in that camp of trying to advocate on behalf of real estate development. We do have to mobilize support to make sure that gets funded so that we
But
can
I mean, the
fund
problem is
the
you
park,
lose the
but-
private.
Yes. Luckily, we, as Joan is saying too, we have only worked with very enlightened developers, and part of that means that they have had a very robust community outreach as well. But our nonprofit, Build Public, we do a very good job of getting together friends of groups and involving people in the design process from the beginning. So I think that's something that just brings everyone into the fold. So we had a bunch of community charrettes to figure out what should go where and what they need and what sort of programming they want. And that has then evolved up into the stewardship entity. So I think, one of our special sauce pieces is we don't just do the box checking community engagement, we sort of bring them into the fold permanently with the promise of, look, we're gonna need help figuring out what the neighborhood wants in terms of managing this space over time. So be part of that as well. I can talk about the community engagement side of things on some of these other projects more, that were a little bit more contentious.
Specifically, shifting to neighborhoods around San Francisco that had an old style character that is inevitably going to be changing, and how do you deal with the people who want to keep the old style attractiveness when you're saying, no matter what you do, that's not sustainable anymore? I mean, that's the situation we face.
Yeah. The projects that we have worked on, even the developments aren't raising Victorians or like old
Yeah.
pieces of character. So, the next slide is about another street conversion to a plaza, but the development is happening on the current parking lot. So there hasn't been a lot of, and this neighborhood in particular, like this particular couple blocks has not had housing. There's a warehouse on one side. The one thing that the community did get pretty angry about is this used to be Club Cafe Kokomo. If anybody's used to be, it's like a salsa dancing place. And so it was a sort of a cultural icon. But it wasn't they weren't homes that people were, needing to get back, ousted from. I do think too, like just thinking about the culture here versus up there is generally a much greater acceptance of change because things are changing. And usually by the time we get involved in the process, there's already awareness that change is happening. So yeah, like this wasn't a particularly residential neighborhood. The Soma project, actually, you go back one slide, or two more. Yeah, so this is in Dogpatch. Eagle Plaza is in Western Soma, which is sort of right where all the streets, called the armpit, where all the streets shift their orientation. And there's almost no residential here either. So the fact that part of the funding for this is coming from a new housing project. Also, housing is then just the biggest major issue in San Francisco now, too. So I think so far we haven't encountered the housing moratorium people on any of our projects, but I think most San Franciscans are aware we just need more housing. This one is also not in a residential area yet, although it will be. So I think that is, it's an interesting question. We haven't gotten the NIMBYs in the same way that, or like sort of the status quo people in the same way. And when we do, we actually just bring them right on in and say, hey, why don't you be part of the solution? And they usually either join the Friends of group that we've created, or they kind of just, like go off of it.
So you keep talking about enlightening developers and working with the community, but don't you also need enlightened public officials?
Yes.
And how do you deal with that?
Yes, that's a challenge.
Elect them. Elect them.
Well, the elected officials, the elected officials all love what we do because we are building, community spaces that are democratic and open for everybody. And so it's it would be tough for them to oppose a new public space project. So they're kind of our ace in the hole typically. Like if we encounter major resistance from city staff on certain things, we can have the supervisory office kind of come in and say, hey, why is this being held up for 8-10 months? Can we expedite this? This is an important thing for the community, and that has worked. I will say too, again, in San Francisco, like the planning department is totally on board with all this stuff. They're very ready, I think in a refreshing way compared, I think, sort of to a lot of suburban communities. They're very ready to accept that streets don't need to always be 100% for cars. They have a whole complete streets program and plan, and we need to make streets safer for pedestrians and bicycles. The whole Vision Zero campaign, there's been a bunch of pedestrian and cyclist deaths on streets, and so there's awareness of the need to incorporate other modes besides cars. So that paves the way for us to unpave streets, I guess.
Maybe it's also size. I know that there is resistance in the city for the George Lucas massive thing, and that's a size thing up against the residential area. But you seem to be looking at little pockets.
Do you want to, I was going to say, it's already 9:50. If you want to, if we could hold the questions for a little bit, and I'm
Sure.
one of the abusers as well.
Yeah,
Go through
I can go through these pretty quickly because this Dogpatch Plaza, the same formula is being applied on Eagle Plaza and Oak Plaza. Also, our website has all these projects in greater detail, and they all link to their own. Each project has its own website that all the full plans are up and available on, so you can always dive into more detail on the actual design and those sorts of things. So yeah, let's go forward a couple slides. Eagle Plaza. Yeah, I'm actually just not even going to talk about Eagle Plaza or Oak Plaza. Happy to take questions on it later. But I do want to talk just for 5 minutes about green benefit districts because that's a really unique and special thing. Next slide. So, and maybe scroll ahead a couple because I don't have to do that whole sequence of things. But Basically, a green benefit district, it's a type of assessment district. It's a variation on the business improvement district. So that's been thought about here, like Lava contemplated becoming a bid at some point. It basically formalizes the funding mechanism for how you contribute to a neighborhood scale association. So a business improvement district usually involves a commercial core, and every property owner or business owner in the district contributes a small sum of money every year as an extra line item on their property taxes, and then collectively that group decides what to do with it. And it's run by a nonprofit board, which is required by the state of California. In San Francisco, bids for whatever reason are called community benefit districts, actually very likely because community and benefits sounds much better than business and improvement in lovely San Francisco. So we created a new tool in 2013, our nonprofit, called the Green Benefit District. And what it is a residential version of the same tool. So the key ingredients are you have a specific geographic boundary, and every property owner within the boundary pays an annual assessment on their property taxes. It's called a Green Benefit District. It's a line. The only way that that happens is through a series of votes by the people in the district. So it's quite difficult to form these, but once they're formed, they last for 10 to 15 years, and the purpose of them is quite broad, but it gives the neighborhood money to improve their public realm. They can do, they can fund services like extra street sweeping or anything that's above and beyond what the city would already be doing that they need in their neighborhood. They can fund capital improvements, so they can squirrel their money away for a year or two and then do a major public project. It's all a really interesting form of kind of hyper-local transparent democracy. So let's go ahead, another slide or two, one more. They're very innovative, and this is what's been getting us attention on a national scale. They are, this way to try to restore people's faith in democracy and taxation and collective action, right? Because every individual, you're contributing in the GBD that we have created in the Dogpatch and Potrero neighborhoods. Everyone pays 9 cents a square foot. Actually, I have a slide on that. One forward. One more. There we go. So we have created the first ever green benefit district in the country. It's 2 zones, but it's in the Dogpatch. This is pretty much the whole Dogpatch neighborhood of San Francisco, and then the northwest corner of Potrero Hill. It's all part of one district, but they have 2 different zones. And they each pay 9 cents per square foot for their building property. So if you have a 1,000 square foot condo, which is rather common, you're paying $90 a year. But collectively, they have over $500,000 to play with for neighborhood-specific improvements. I think that's something that Los Altos could consider if, when I'm hearing again and knowing the history here of wanting to see action, but being frustrated that the pace of city processes is slightly slower, necessarily for a lot of reasons. Neighborhoods can take matters into their own hands and start doing their own greening and cleaning. And services, like we're working on an inner Sunset Green Benefit District now, and one of their main interests is in bringing sort of street support services. So homeless support services, they get a lot of homeless people coming in from the Golden Gate Park onto the 9th and Irving corridor, and they would like to provide more services in their neighborhood than the city's homeless outreach team can do. When a neighborhood raises their hand and says, "City, I want this," the city says, "Look, we can't give you preferential treatment. We don't have the resources, but you can do it." Now more and more neighborhoods are actually reaching out to us and trying to help them do that.
It seems like the organizational overlay is more important than the money.
Yeah, and yes, thank you. And one of the most critically wonderful things about green benefit districts is the political and social capital that you get from having an extraordinarily organized group that is actually putting their money where their mouth is. We just had a meeting in the Bayview about the Bayview Green Benefit District, and that is the thing that they're the most excited about is, each property owner may not be able to contribute very much money, particularly in that neighborhood or whatever neighborhood, but you've shown that you've created this amazingly strong social network that is underpinned by legal structure, and it's a 501c3 nonprofit, and the amount of outside funding from grants and the city and sort of political clout you can get is amazing. Inner Sunset is also very interested in the GBD for that reason. Turns out that 9th and Irving corridor where, so there's a lot of businesses, is at the intersection of 4 supervisor districts. So they're kind of in the backwater of all these 4 districts, and there's no supervisor that's like, I'm the Inner Sunset supervisor. So if they had a GBD, they could start advocating on their own behalf a little bit stronger. Yeah, that's GBD. I think there are any more slides there. It takes about 2 years to form them. It takes a long time. Let's see, go back on the 2 slides. One more. This is all I'll talk about that, but there's a pretty rigorous formation process that has to happen, and ultimately a district has to be approved by the city that it's in, because it's a legal taxation tool, and the city actually collects the funds along with property taxes and then redistributes them back to that nonprofit that's running the GBD. And I think, so those are all my slides, I think. Move forward. Yeah, so that's a website. Next, yeah, and that's it. Oh, one more. And this is my other project. This is Maya. She's 1 year old. This is us sitting on the bench in front of a living tree, which actually has my mom's name on it. So yeah, happy to. There's a couple of minutes for questions, right?
Yep, yeah,
Like
we can
7.
go over a couple minutes too.
Okay, yeah.
Do you have a favorite designer, developer, city planner that you work with?
In the city, in San
In the city
Francisco?
or anywhere?
We work with
If you
different.
want, you can turn the lights on.
Oh, yeah, let's do that. We work with different landscape architectures. So we're a team of 3. I'm the executive director and I have 2 staff. We're a small ship, but we speak all the different languages. So we then work directly with landscape architects, CMG design, Dogpatch Plaza. We're working with a landscape architecture team from Snowhetta Architects on Oak Plaza. Snowhetta designed the new SF MoMA, international firm. There's another firm called Bionic that's doing the Eagle Plaza project. So we work with landscape architects. We have a good list of allies in the city, in each department, who we can call on to say, look, here's an out-of-the-box thing. All the projects that we do are kind of pushing the boundaries. And, I forget who I was just talking to about, we're trying new processes. I think it was John, right? When you try to do something new, it's not that a city doesn't want it, they just don't know how to do it. So we're walking the city of San Francisco through all these different things. The first time the public plaza has been done in the way that it has with this in-kind funding tool. It's the first time we're doing these living alleys grants to improve alleyways. It's the first time a GBD has ever been done. And so we kind of have to handhold, and there are people that don't get it, and there are people that do get it. And we just maintain a good relationship with the ones that do.
Well, the reason I asked that, excuse me for being indirect, to me, the First Street Green project didn't go forward because the planning wasn't good enough. The design wasn't good enough. And those involved think I don't want it to happen, but I just saw that the design wasn't good enough as of yet. So, because it didn't take everything into account, all the people in Los Altos, the traffic flow. I'm wondering if you have a city planner that you also work with, besides landscape architects.
Private sector, like a consultant.
Well, to me, there's so much involved in the project, because if you take out parking places, then what do you do? If you redirect traffic flow, then what do you do? The whole project, I'm a builder myself, so I'm nuts and bolts. How do you make the project work in all aspects? Concrete, physical aspects.
I think maybe it's a similar, I don't know if this is the best analogy, but that's a bit of a hardware question, and it's often more the software that is the, will make
I think that's a highly debatable discussion. The project didn't go forward because the developer, who could not wait another 10 months for the visioning to end, to make sure they got the 3 votes that were necessary. The public was dramatically in favor of the project. So let's talk about reality and not about your particular vision of what did and didn't happen. That's not what happened. Developer could no longer wait for another 8 to 10 months while construction costs were rising at 20 to 25% a year. The last time there was a public, the ENA was affected. There were 67 people voted who came to speak in favor of it. 7 people came to speak against it. They handled every single complaint that came from every single nearby resident. So if you're going to bring something up publicly, let's bring up reality. Let's not bring up something that happens to be your vision of the world. It's not fair to the people in the room. It's not fair to the community.
I'd like to hear Brooke's answer. David, you and I can debate this in private.
Well, you brought it up in public, and it has nothing to do with your presentation.
And I will say, I not knowing the firms that were involved with the project, I don't think I can weigh in on it either.
I'd like to just comment on the Blue Bottle Alley. John and I bought a place pretty close to there, and we were really shocked. Like, we went down this alley, and many of the alleys have a lot of homeless, not a lot, but a few homeless people that move around. They're not just permanently there. They just stay there for the night at their tent and they move on. Anyway, we go down this alley and we actually run into Brooke Ray. We're like, what are you doing here? And then there's this alley that cars are actually driving through. Like, it is not a pedestrian-only space. Cars are actually driving through. There's these rock formations that appear to be benches where you can sit and hang out. I'm sure there were trees they maybe took out, but they put in new trees. It's really very small, but so functional and so beautiful.
And the contrast to our block, which is the same alley, is dramatic, because ours is unimproved, it's just sheer building faces.
And parking.
Parking, and
It's beautiful.
broken glass from car windows that are broken regularly, and homeless people. And you go one block to the space you create, and it's like this little oasis.
And it makes cars slow down.
Yeah.
So if there's people standing there, the people move out of the way or whatever, it just works. It's crazy, and it's in San Francisco. So it's really an amazing project you did. That's so tiny, but so well done.
Yeah, and that has become a model for what public spaces could, and it has a lot of challenges too, as you know. I mean, one of the things, we're working on an extension of those improvements right now, and in addition to actual physical improvements, we're going to be putting overhead string lighting, like artistic lighting, these like kaleidoscopic lanterns on the alley, so that you have nighttime safety and daytime beautification, and more benches and more seating. But the biggest component that the Friends of Linden Alley want is better maintenance, because every night the homeless people come and knock over every single trash can, dump every single piece of trash out on the street, and every morning the Friends of Linden Alley have a guy that comes and sweeps it up, because the Public Works Department can't do it every morning. But it's, that's the state, that's sort of some of the bigger social issues that we are facing in San Francisco that luckily you guys don't, you don't have to deal with that part of things here, which is wonderful. Let's see again.
I'm just wondering if you've ever worked with Van Jones on the green collar economy. We could potentially get that.
I haven't yet.
Always in town, or next week. But he has this green collar economy, which is exactly taking those people that right now are tearing it down to potentially, instead of overnight tearing it down, cooperate with the community.
Yes, there's actually a really cool program that the city of San Francisco has, that they're using at the Civic Center, called the Downtown Streets Team. It was actually started, do you guys are familiar with that? Yeah, it's just so, and it was started by some tech folks, I think, in Palo Alto, but it hires hires anyone who wants to. So homeless people can come. They have to pass a little bit of a training, and they have to commit to come, a certain number of days per week. And then they put on a t-shirt and they pick up trash and they talk to their fellow homeless people and say, hey, can you not poop here because we're cleaning, and then they get food and clothing vouchers. Right. It's so cool. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know how much more time is left, but I just wanted to, it was great working with you down here, and thanks so much for coming down and showing us the great stuff you're doing in San Francisco. It's so innovative, the experiments are great. It's really exciting to look at opportunities, things that we might think about doing here, so thank you.
Robin?
I think it's fabulous. The governance, right, the whole life cycle, right, the transparency, just fabulous innovation.
Thanks. Yeah, it's hard. It's been hard work, but really valuable.
And inspirational, Brooke Ray, to us, because, we've been at it 6-7 years, right? And it's like, God, Moses, right? Look what you did. And we're still stuck.
I know.
Sorry for being late, but you've already answered this question, and I apologize ahead of time. What was your breakthrough moment in this, in getting it going and getting started?
On the nonprofit or on one of these projects or just?
You choose.
Actually, interesting, it's something you guys will appreciate is early on when I was trying to learn about San Francisco, and I'd been living there for most of the time that I was working down here in Los Altos, but I was trying to sort of wrap my head around why are things the way they are. There's some pretty perplexing, city governance structures and, community attitudes about things, and, I had an aha moment was, oh, San Francisco, it's like a big city, but it's really not very different from Los Angeles. Politically, and the way that things, the way that, just the way the processes work. I think city is always trying to do what's right for the community, but there's a constant challenge of trying to make sure that you're listening to the real community and not just the squeaky wheels or just the, so there's a caution and a mistrust of community, that I see a lot up in San Francisco. I think San Francisco in particular has such a strong grassroots, anti-establishment culture, right? That's built into San Francisco. They did the freeway revolt. It's, summer of love is all the reunion, anniversaries are happening and stuff. And so they have there's this history of like community against the establishment. And so that there's tension there, and it means that things don't flow as smoothly. I think once I started realizing some more of the nuances of, it's really, another aha that's related is it's all about the politics. I mean, I'm an urban planner. I went to Berkeley, got my urban planning master's, and that's not how the world works. I think we all know that now, but that's been helpful to, I think the antidote is the transparency is the new green, and we're trying the new 21st century way, and I think, that's a little bit more our generation's contribution to this whole game is, let's just be a little more transparent, and why wouldn't we be? And, sometimes it gets you in trouble, but I think most of the time it's a really good thing to over-involve. It makes things take a little bit longer sometimes, but that's sort of, there's been a couple aha moments.
I think one of the keys is trying to get the private, get the connection of public and private partnership. And I think that when there's been numerous speakers at Los Altos Forward, there's been numerous presentations about how to work public and private. And there's just this inherent, on the part of some community, some residents, there's just this inherent distrust of anyone who happens to be a, quote, developer. And it could be that the developer has absolutely the best interests of the town in their hearts, as Los Altos Community Investments did and does. And that's, to me, that's the toughest struggle. It isn't just the struggle with, we now have a much better planning department. We, in my opinion, have a much better city manager than we had 5 years ago. But the other problem is just to get the public awareness and get the narrative going that public-private is the best way to have a win-win. And, was that a big part of what?
Oh, yeah. And I think I was lucky to have my first professional real teeth cutting was Passerelle, which is this very genuinely public benefit minded company. You can do it. You can have both and. And there aren't these like, we're not little gremlins in the closet behind the scenes being like, ha ha ha, we're gonna take advantage of them, ultimately.
Well, and then there's
just
city
nothing
after
there.
city,
That's me.
there's city after city that has done public-private partnerships that have been really successful for the health of the town. So I just wanted, as what we do with Los Altos Community Coalition, is just to try to get the education and let everyone, let it be open to
Yeah, no, I
all
think-
views and all. That is an inherent distrust that we have in town and that almost every suburban town has. They don't want to be tagged as a bedroom community, they are bedroom communities. And it is very difficult as a commercial real estate broker to get private business to want to be in a town that doesn't really want business to be there. And people want it, they want it both ways. They want to have the great restaurants, but they don't want to do anything to increase the office workers that'll help get feet on the street for great. There's all those, that is the fundamental tug of war going on right now in our town. And I think if the public and private, people could realize the benefit of the win-win of public-private working together, it would be terrific. And I think that's, hopefully we'll have another Brooke Ray that'll come down to Los Altos and create a public, basically a nonprofit that just, we kind of have one with LACF, Los Altos Community Foundation, which is our sponsor for our organization, does really do, everything they do is for the benefit of Los Altos. There's not a single ounce of them that has any vested interest other than public benefit.
But they don't work with government.
But they don't work with government.
So you have to
They
have-
basically fund nonprofits.
Yeah, you have the political aspect.
Right.
I mean, that's one key advantage of us being this nonprofit is, I think the key to public-private partnerships is the communication and this, translation, and to be a nonprofit makes us a lovely, impartial, we are not private sector, we're not a government, we're bringing everyone together, and that's been helpful. The other thing I'll say about public-private partnerships is just, this is my own experience, but I do feel like things are changing I'm like a little older than the millennials, but like the millennial generation gets that much more. Like I feel like it will be changing as millennials rise to the, C-levels and the powerhouses of cities and things that, look, okay, this is how we have to do things. Like this is the best way to do things. It's the most efficient way is actually bringing in the private sector that has the dollars and has the firepower and, will work with cities. And it's been often the younger folks in the city that get that I work with the most and have the best results.
I just want to talk about the future meetings real quick. I know people have to go, and then we can